Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to the Progressive Commentary Hour. Our theme today, what the nurses saw and experienced during the gross negligence and the absolute failure to properly treat COVID patients. My guest today is Ken McCarthy. Now, Ken is an advocate. He has been an advocate of more natural approaches to our problems of health, and he is engaged in exposing the corruption of medicine and is currently an author and publisher. Ken was an early pioneer in the movement to commercialize the internet. Time magazine credits him with being the first to articulate click-through rate as a primary metric for making the internet commercially viable, and was instrumental in the development of website banner ads. His work as an environmentalist included halting the construction of a coal-powered cement plant in the Hudson Valley and the reconstruction of New Orleans levees that he was also instrumental in. Among his books are 2 volumes, The COVID Con, and the Amazon bestseller Fauci's First Fraud, which was important for informing Robert Kennedy Jr.'s The Real Anthony Fauci book. His most recent book, which is very important, is called What the Nurses Saw. It's an investigation into the systematic medical murders, he believes, that took place in hospitals during the COVID pandemic, and the stories of nurses who fought back to save their patients and were frequently fired because of it. Ken's website is whatthenursessaw.com, and it has a lot of important information and articles and interviews and videos to inform the public and citizens about the corruption in hospitals and the medical facilities. The book is What the Nurses Saw. Nice to have you with us today, Ken.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Ken, one of the issues that is almost never discussed is why was there no ability at the federal level and then correspondingly shared by the media of what doctors who are highly skilled and trained to save lives, especially emergency medicine, internal medicine, and even those who were respiratory therapists and cardiologists, when they started seeing people coming in who had these symptoms, that they go to work immediately on those conditions. Instead, they were told, stand down. And when you think about it for a moment, these doctors said, why? We have a patient here with a problem or problems. Why can't we do what we would normally do for someone who came in here if we didn't know what to call it? If we just saw some symptoms, like if you have a heart attack or a stroke, they'll know what to do, and it saves lives. And as a result of that, could you just take us through your research of how many people probably died because they were not treated in a timely manner by people very competent and qualified if you went into an emergency room or hospital to treat you for those symptoms? Let's begin there, please. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. You hit upon a really important point. And the way I can explain it most simply is that if you came to a hospital with any distress of any kind, you were given a COVID test. They would keep testing you over and over again until they finally came up with a positive result. Once you got that positive result, you then entered an alternate medical reality such as we have never seen in the history of medicine. And as you pointed out, and this is the key to really the whole thing, all normal medical procedures that have been established over decades were thrown out the window. Let me give you an example of how extreme it was. If you had a positive COVID test, you were denied simple things such as ibuprofen. You were denied the normal inhaling steroids that are given when somebody presents with severe lung distress. Those were off the table. Those were forbidden. They were as forbidden as ivermectin or any of the other things. This right away had no basis in medical history, medical tradition. It had no scientific basis whatsoever, and it defied all common sense. So that's how they started the game, by testing. And as soon as you came up positive, they could then declare you a COVID patient. Now, this is more of a legal thing. In fact, I would say it was a legal distinction, not a medical or scientific distinction at all. So it appears that somehow, and this has been going on for a long time and to varying degrees, the treatment of patients has been taken over by a political legal system versus a medical scientific system. As for how many people died this way, we can't ever know for sure until a very serious research undertaking starts. I think it has to be on the level of trying to understand why the Challenger exploded, trying to understand what happened to John F. Kennedy, trying to understand so many things that were inexplicable. It has to be on that scale and that number of people, but we can look at basic numbers. Over 1 million people are reported to have, and I put emphasis on the reported to have, died of COVID, over 1 million Americans. Of that number, 92% died in a hospital or healthcare facility. So that brings us to at least 900,000 people went into a hospital or health facility with, quote, COVID, and came out in body bags dead. So does that mean that every single person was killed in the hospital? I don't know. Honestly, don't know. But we know it's not a trivial number. It's got to be a very large number. And that will be clear, especially now that I go into what they call the COVID protocol. So the first part of the protocol, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was, you have inflammation. They wouldn't even give you what they consider the normal treatment for inflammation. You have respiratory distress. They denied you the treatment for respiratory distress. The normal standard of care, right? They're always trumpeting the standard of care. Well, they just threw the standard of care right out the window. Again, with no scientific basis for any of it. The next thing they would do is put you on what's called a BiPAP, and this is called non-invasive ventilation. What is it? What is that? Ventilation is basically having an external source assist your breathing, or in the case of full venting, breathe for you. And there are situations where that is needed. If somebody has, let's say, a super traumatic car injury in a car accident, and they've just, all their functions have stopped. Well, if you don't keep them breathing, they will die in a few minutes. So there is a place for this in medicine. The BiPAP is called non-invasive, which means they put a mask over your face, tight, very tight, strapped behind your head, and they basically force air down your throat. Because the theory is you can't breathe for yourself. Now, the lungs are not designed for that, right? The lungs are designed when the diaphragm descends, oxygen gently comes in, the transfer of gas takes place, and then the diaphragm comes back up, and out comes the waste gases. So the lungs are quite robust, but they deal in a gentle flow. This BiPAP is not a gentle flow. And again, in an emergency situation, you use what needs to be done to save the life. But here's the key about BiPAP, and this is where the death train began. BiPAP is very uncomfortable, very stress-provoking, very anxiety-provoking. So under normal circumstances, a medical team, a doctor, nurses would prepare the patient and say, look, you're obviously having some severe difficulty breathing. We're going to put this thing on your face, a mask. It's called a BiPAP. It's uncomfortable. Don't worry. We're here. We're going to watch you. That's not what they did under COVID. With no explanation, no preparation, they slapped these BiPAPs on people. If you imagine you're driving, you're a passenger in a car, and you open the window and you stick your head out the window of a car going 60 miles an hour. That's what the speed of this air coming in is. The person has a mask on their face. It's scary. They were given no reassurance, and very often they were left abandoned alone in the room with this strange device, creating a lot of anxiety. Many of these people, understandably, became agitated and anxious. They were already afraid that they were deathly ill. They were already in a hospital setting, and now they're experiencing something extremely uncomfortable, and nobody is reassuring them. Nobody is around to even talk to them. They then use this as a pretext for saying, you seem agitated. Can we offer you a tranquilizer or a sedative or whatever the term would be, depending on the hospital? And the person very often would say yes. And that began a steady stream of tranquilizers. Now, what do we know about tranquilizers? Well, they relax the body. What do we know about the muscles of the body? They get relaxed. What do we know about the diaphragm? It's actually a very interesting complex organ, but you can think of it as a muscle. It starts to not function as well. It relaxes too. So when you give somebody a sedative, you run the risk of depressing their breathing ability. So they've brought the person in the hospital. They've segregated them. They've denied them anti-inflammatories. They've denied them inhaled steroids. They've slapped this BiPAP on them with no explanation at all. And then they start pumping them with tranquilizers. And now the next thing begins the offer for remdesivir, because remdesivir apparently, and I still don't understand this. I'm still waiting for someone to explain how a failed Ebola drug that gave every appearance of injuring organs suddenly became the only acceptable treatment for COVID. In the beginning, nobody knew what remdesivir was. And, we have to put ourselves in the situation of these patients. I think if I find myself in a hospital, an emergency situation, the doctor's saying this is going to help you, I'm probably going to say yes, as educated as I am. And most people said yes to the remdesivir. Later, as people discovered remdesivir was not a gold standard cure and was actually harmful, there was deception. They said, oh, it's not remdesivir, it's, I can't remember the term right now, Valcaline or whatever. There's another term for remdesivir. So they would outright lie to the patients. I was told in Canada, it doesn't appear in the book, but it's one of the interviews, that they were telling people they were giving them vitamin C when they were giving them remdesivir. So the push to give people remdesivir. And one of the adverse reactions of remdesivir is organ failure. And so that's the next step. And then as people were failing, between the not getting treated for the inflammation, between not getting treated for the respiratory distress, between being pumped with sedatives, anxiety, just mounted on anxiety, and then remdesivir, which was causing them to be ill, then the doctor would say, well, you're not doing very well. I think we have to vent you. So I talked earlier about non-invasive ventilation and invasive. Invasive ventilation is a very serious medical procedure. You have to paralyze the patient with drugs. You have to give the patient very powerful drugs, including often fentanyl, to deal with the pain of the procedure. You have to knock the person out. And the colloquial term for the pipe, the hose that they stick down your throat, goes right down your throat all the way into your lungs, is the garden hose. That's what they call it in the hospitals because it's big. And it's not a trivial procedure. Again, it has a role in medicine, but as our respiratory therapist, Mark Bashofsky, who we interviewed for the book, 24 years, sterling record, he told us, we do it, but we only do it under the most dire of circumstances. But under COVID and this new medical alternate reality, if you simply had a positive COVID test, you were put on the road to invasive ventilation. Now, as soon as you ventilate somebody that way, the clock starts ticking. You really don't want anybody to be vented for a prolonged period of time. Why? There's a risk of infection because you have a pipe right straight into your lungs. Your lungs are not designed to deal with that kind of thing. You're also being pumped, as I mentioned, not with one dose of fentanyl, but with a drip of fentanyl and all the other drugs, the paralytics, the other analgesics. That isn't healthy. You're not moving, which isn't healthy. If you want to make somebody sick, probably the simplest thing to do is not allow them to move for a prolonged period of time. You're being fed by basically sugar water. That's not very healthy. And I asked some of the nurses, how did you hydrate the patients? And the answer was, well, there's fluid in the bags. So there was no hydration. So it, again, under the appropriate circumstances, if it's a choice of life and death, maybe you vent the person. Otherwise, you stay as far away from this procedure as you possibly can. The normal procedure is after somebody's been on a vent for 24 hours, the respiratory therapist, and that's the expert on the management of patients who are being vented, does tests and sees, hey, can we take this person off? Are they strong enough to breathe on their own? They're constantly testing for that because they want to get the person off the vent as soon as possible. One of the most sinister things in this COVID death train was that hospitals were incentivized to vent patients. They got a bonus, and we describe that in the appendix of our book. Somebody contributed a really good deep dive research on the financials of this. So I'm drawing a blank on the exact amount, but it was a serious amount of money, like in the 5 figures. And what I learned in the course of doing the book was not only were they incentivized for this heavy duty ventilation, they were also incentivized if they kept a patient on the vent for 96 hours or more. There is no medical reason to do that in the world, in the history of medicine. There is no scientific reason to do it. There's no common sense reason to do it. There's no ethical reason to do it, but it was incentivized, so the hospitals did it. So to recap this, if you came to the hospital, not just with respiratory distress, but really with anything, and you created a positive COVID result in the test, you were put in an alternate medical reality. All normal medical procedure was thrown out the window, and a whole bunch of highly incentivized procedures that made no medical sense, no scientific sense, no common sense, and were actually visibly ruinous to the health of the patients was employed. And I didn't mention that remdesivir was also heavily financially incentivized. So, initially I thought, okay, a lot of the problems that happen in the hospitals were a result of chaos and of not knowing. And I can't blame anybody in a state of chaos who doesn't know. You do what you can. Okay, I understand that. But then as I dug deeper, it was, well, this wasn't just the chaos of the situation. There were a lot of procedural things that were being done. One of the things I learned very early on, before I really understood this death train COVID protocol, was that in the public hospitals in New York City, which, if people remember, the way this show, and it was very much a show, unfolded, they started panicking us with images of China. Then they panicked us with images of Italy, northern Italy. And then the next part of the next episode, I guess you'd call it, was panicking the rest of the United States with images from New York City. What we weren't told was in New York City, they were bringing in doctors and nurses who had no ICU experience whatsoever and having them manage ICU patients. If you're a doctor, let's say you're the most esteemed doctor in Austria, or Germany, and you come to the United States, that qualifies you to mop floors. You don't get to practice medicine in the United States until you've jumped through all the United States hoops. During COVID, and again, one of these legalistic dashes of the pen, suddenly any doctor from any country with any track record was allowed to come to the United States and practice. I don't know what these contract doctors were paid, but I do know that the nurses alone in the New York City hospitals who came in as contractors were paid $10,000 a week. And you heard that correct, $10,000 a week. The money came from the Department of Homeland Security. It was funneled through a small handful of agencies who I'm sure took a huge cut. And I bet if we have an investigative reporter out there that wants a project, find out who owns these agencies and what politicians they're connected to. And the nurses, this really blew my mind. I understood that sometimes graduate nurses, they'd just gotten out of school and hadn't even had their practical experience yet, were put in the ICUs to help manage ICU patients. I later learned that nurses that were still in school, they hadn't even completed their degree, were put into these hospitals to care for patients. We had doctors in the ICUs in the New York City hospitals who were podiatrists or gynecologists. They had no ICU experience at all. Many of them, there were a lot of residents. In some cases, the supervising physicians were nowhere to be seen, and the residents were ruling the roost, as one veteran nurse told me. This is a recipe for absolute disaster. And of course, it's easy if you have a bunch of uninformed, unexperienced people to coerce them or trick them into doing things that make no medical sense. So who did the coercion? Well, the way I reconstruct it, and I talked about this with all the nurses and all the medical professionals I spoke with. I said, who actually really runs the hospital? Is it the doctors? Is it the nurses? I mean, on one level, the doctors have a lot of power. On another level, the nurses are actually the ones doing the actual work. But the people that call the shots are the administrators. And these are the people who have a direct connection to the CFO of the hospital, the chief financial officer, the people that are counting the money. And the people who, the way the enforcement, this is the other part, not only did the protocols make no sense, not only did they obviously seriously injure and in many cases outright kill people, they were enforced with an iron fist. And here's what I mean by that. If you were a veteran nurse, not a new graduate who didn't know what was going on, but someone that had worked in ICUs for years and years and years, and you objected to any of the things that you were told to do or that you saw going on around you, you were first disciplined, and then you were fired. You were taken out of the scene. So that was that's pretty good enforcement. The nurses that I interviewed took various steps. Some of them reached out to the news media. Some of them reached out to law enforcement. Some of them reached out to social services agencies on the phone with these groups saying, look, there's a disaster happening here in New York City. We are killing patients. And they were uniformly ignored. The next part of the enforcement came during the we'll call it the injectable rollout. I'm not going to call it a vaccine. Any nurse that stuck their head up, raised their hand and reported, hey, we're seeing severe injuries from these vaccines. They were not only fired on the spot, they were also tracked down. Everyone's, I think, familiar with the concept of internet trolls. Well, some of those trolls are not random people. They're actually troll mobs that have been very consciously recruited, trained, and managed and deployed. And we traced one of these troll mobs right back, believe it or not, this almost sounds like a dystopian novel, right back to the UN. The Undersecretary of Communications for the UN was crowing about how she was working with a group called Team Halo and how they were given special rights. I believe it was a TikTok. In other words, anything they wanted to post was okay. And they were literally tracking down nurses who were speaking out, doxing them, which means revealing their home address and their phone number, and setting the internet mob on them. And so these internet mobs are organized. And one of the chapters in the book was with a journalist who did research on the formation of this particular internet mob. And there was actual, recruitment. People were trained. There were staging areas. You'd come to the website and it'd say, okay, we're going to go after Nurse Jones today. Here's her Twitter. Here's her Facebook. Here's where she lives. It got so bad that some nurses actually had people showing up at their homes. And the death threats, of course, threats of violence against them. So we had a medical protocol that had no basis in medical history or experience, no basis in science, no basis in common sense, was obviously injuring and killing people, enforced with and incentivized to a degree that I don't think has ever occurred in the history of medicine, and then enforced with a really well-organized hate and attack machine. And of course, once these trolls get going, then a lot of other unbalanced people feel it's okay for them to pile on too. So this is what we faced. And how many died, I don't know. But if we look at the basic number, over 1 million died of COVID, 92%, that gets us to well over 900,000 died. It's very possible that hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of this mayhem. And now here's the two scary things about this. Number one, some of us were aware that something was off. I don't think anybody really realized the extent of it until I just happened to be interested in talking to lots of nurses. I didn't understand the extent of it. My original intention was just to capture the memories of these nurses of this dark time, and bit by bit, this this realization emerged that this wasn't an accident, this wasn't incompetence, this was a system that was put in place consciously. So that's my one worry, that hardly anybody knows this happened. And then the other worry is that this system, and they've really kind of perfected mass murder. This is if that's your goal, and you want to do it off the radar, so-called, they've kind of perfected it. This system is still in place. They could announce, disease X or disease Y or disease Z tomorrow, come up with some, ridiculous test, declare that everybody's got it, declare that these are the only protocols that just coincidentally kill everybody, and run everybody through the system. So this machine, which I feel is a mass killing machine, can be fired up at any time. Now, was this intentional? And I have to say, I don't see how it could be anything but intentional. There had to be a room of people, probably in Washington, D.C., saying, okay, how can we cause the most harm? Let's see. They've got information. Yes.
Ken, don't go there. You're too smart. All right? I've given you just now 26 minutes to lay out your argument. Here's the problem, and this I found in a lot of other areas of medicine and healthcare. You, up to this point, everything that you have stated, I can independently confirm is accurate. I've spent thousands upon thousands of hours doing in-depth research on this very topic. In fact, I was the first person to write a comprehensive scholarly article showing all of the benefits from the different hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that Anthony Fauci said did not exist. And we have that clip where he says, no, there's no benefit from taking ivermectin. Well, we showed there was. We showed all the articles. We showed the hospitals, the universities, the number of patients, the number of scientists, and the peer-reviewed publications. So that was very clear. You can either believe Anthony Fauci when he says there's no benefit, or you can believe the actual studies, and we put it all together. And other people use that list, including frontline doctors, once we put it together. We also took a look at the different ways that we were all equally susceptible, every person on earth. Well, that wasn't true. It had almost nothing to do with science. It had to do with a failed policy that originated in its inception from Imperial College in London, where the person who was the, let's call him a biostatistician, said, here's how many people are going to die in every country in the world. And these were astronomically overblown numbers, far beyond anything that actually happened. So people in countries freaked out. And they said, my goodness, what if he's right? And because he had it published in a peer-reviewed journal, nobody went back to see how many times has he been wrong. We did. We did the first expose on that. And as a result, people were overreacting, much like they did with AIDS. There was a time when everything told about AIDS was simply scientifically implausible or incorrect. In fact, at 3 o'clock this morning, I'm sitting here doing editing on the latest figures that now have acknowledged they were wrong. I'm talking about the top people in the world of AIDS, all except Anthony Fauci and a few others, and Gallo. But they said the wrong things then. Who led the war on AIDS? Well, it wasn't Gallo. It was Anthony Fauci, because he controlled where the money went. And how much money was spent? At one time, we were spending $10 billion, and that went up to $50 billion under George Bush. And yet nobody was saying, do we have a test that can actually determine, is this person sick? And the answer was no. It was symptoms. As a result, they were looking for people who had non-productive dry cough, a fever, had lost some body weight. And that was it. You were diagnosed. But Fauci made it even easier. If your T cells are under 200, you've got AIDS. Really? So I challenged it back then. I put 20,000 hours of research into that, did 5 award-winning documentaries and over 40 articles, and a textbook called AIDS: A Second Opinion with over 4,000 scientific references showing almost everything they told us about AIDS. AIDS was real, the conditions were real, but we'd always had them. And the cofactors were what were missing in the Fauci scenario, and yet They said 1 weak retrovirus did all this. A virus so weak you couldn't find it in many people's bloods. That's like saying, the patient died from 27 bullets to the body on autopsy. How many bullets did you find? None. Well, then why are you saying the person died of gunshot? Well, because that's what we're supposed to do. Everyone fell in line, because if you didn't fall in line with Anthony Fauci back then, you were excoriated. The very contempt that is held now for anyone speaking out, and was for the last 4 years, to the nurses that you interviewed, to the death threats they got. Highly prestigious doctors who didn't believe in anything. I would have been on the other side of debating McCullough and Cole and Pierre Corey. I would have been their nemesis, because I've been able to see protocols that reverse these conditions without the medical implementations that they are so specialized in. Most of them took the vaccine. It was only when they saw the lies of COVID that they then said, oh my goodness, when they were attacked for the first time in their careers. But I was there when any doctor in America practicing good medicine and saving lives was doing it without the approval of the FDA or the National Academy of Sciences or the state medical boards. They were saving lives. Some of these people went to prison. I know I helped get Dr. James Privateer out of prison. What was his crime? He helped over 227 people who received orthodox cancer therapy regain their immune system. He wasn't denouncing any of the therapies. He was complimenting the therapy that they didn't know how to use and knew nothing about, immune augmentation. For that, in the state of California, the state of California was that ass backwards on everything. They threw him in prison in a chain gang. When his wife came to me, I started a campaign, and I was syndicated, and we got him out of jail. I helped over 60 doctors who were losing their license, from Warren Levin to Robert Atkins and so many others. Why? Because they were not good doctors. To the contrary, they were exceptional doctors. They didn't have to risk losing their license by trying something that was more natural and complementary, but they did, because these were the real heroes. I feel that 90% or more of the 900,000 more or less doctors who were involved in COVID could have found the truth that you found, because they're closer to the scene than you were. So here you are, an outsider coming in because you're curious of why there's so many contradictions between good science and bad medical practice. Well, they're there every day. They see it. Do you think these doctors don't talk with the nurses, and the nurses don't talk with each other? So look at how few nurses came forward, and look at how few doctors came forward. I saw the first 15 of them, invite them on my program, because only then did they have something in common with me and my audience. The truth. All right? Now they're held as heroes. I don't hold anyone a hero who was the person who could put you in a hospital because of iatrogenesis and not recognize the things they were doing with their protocols, no matter what their esteem, their position within the medical hierarchy, were considered unique and exceptional and special. When in point of fact, they simply were using the protocols that had worked for them up to that point, even if the patient's outcome was not the best. Only in America can a person get rewarded for their patients dying. Look at chemotherapy. Look at psychiatry. Look at the overuse of drugs. So when we have more than enough information, the last thing you should do, in my opinion, is speculate on motive. Because we have no evidence that there was a room where people stood around and says, let's see what we can do in a negative way. Because if that was a court of law and someone sued you for slander, they could say, show us the proof. And libel and slander, if you can show that what you said is the truth, then you're defended. What if you can't? And I see this all over the world now as people speculating. So I'm merely saying, you got more than enough, buddy, on your side to make your case. Don't go Alex Jones. All right? Don't go down that path of speculating, because then the merits of your real argument are lost. I'm sorry if that sounds a little strong, but I've seen too many people in this field make that mistake. Would you agree?
Well,
Is
I
what
appreciate
said
that.
reasonable
No, I
or
appreciate
not?
that, Gary.
Okay,
I
because I've
appreciate
been
that.
there.
And can I say something? I'm 64, so I was in my 20s in the 80s, and I grew up in New York City. And we might there are probably some younger people listening right now. You cannot believe what the atmosphere in New York City was like in the 80s around AIDS, and what courage and integrity it took for Gary, because he was the leader. He was absolutely the leader of questioning the AIDS, HIV equals AIDS equals certain death hypothesis. Well, let me give you an example of how crazy it was. Gary, you may remember this. At some point in the late 80s, Oprah Winfrey on her show, which in those days had 40 million people, told her audience that by 1990, 1 out of 5 of them would be dead from AIDS. This was how strong the hysteria was. And anybody that dared say anything against the hierarchy was attacked viciously. Celia Farber's a friend of mine, so I've seen it firsthand, and I know the attacks against you. So what Gary's saying about this, he can't possibly state strongly enough the headwinds that he had to go against to be the first person to come out against the AIDS hoax. Again, not that there aren't serious diseases that have the characteristics of AIDS, obviously that occurs, but the causation and how to treat it, anybody that dared, I mean, death threats, the things that were done to Celia were horrific. And it was a forerunner for exactly what happened with COVID. And it's not easy to take this role and to stick with it for decades.
Well, here's where we're at, Ken, because I want to get into, I want to let Ryan in our studio. We have 2 outstanding board operators there who help run that station and make sure the shows get on in time. And we're going to play a couple clips from your research to show people these are real nurses making real honest statements. They put their reputation and career on the line to do this. Now, these are people that I respect. And that's why I said, Ken, you didn't have to get involved in this. You didn't have to go out there and do the work that reporters for the New York Times could have done. Rachel Maddow could have done this, right? She was saying, get the vaccine. If you get the vaccine, you're not going to get infected. Get the vaccine, you're not going to get spread it to other people, and you're not going to go to the hospital and die. All misinformation. Now, what I won't do, and have never done, I will not ascribe motive, because I know that a lot of people have good intention. I don't believe that a single oncologist going in to see a patient says, I want to make more money today. I'm going to give you a very expensive chemotherapy that has never been really shown to save lives over a period of time, because I'm buying it at wholesale, true story, and selling it to you at retail. And that's only one of 2 areas. A lot of rheumatologists do the same thing. I don't believe that any one of those want to see that patient die. The fact that they know they're rewarded even when the patients die is a failure of the entire paradigm of medicine. I wrote a book on this called Death by Medicine, did a documentary, Death by Medicine, only using their figures, and it showed that more people die each year from mistakes made by medicine than die of heart disease or cancer. So, and that was independently confirmed. And I sent that article out to 7,000 different scientific publications and said, if I'm wrong, show me I'm wrong. And no one could. And yet they won't talk about it. So when it comes to COVID, understand who was the architect. It was Fauci. Who was in my opinion, the person who led the media believing that we only have one problem. That's HIV virus. And I discovered it, he said. Well, that wasn't true. In point of fact, the person who discovered was not one person, it was a team. And they would later be given the Nobel Prize collectively without the person in the United States who claimed he had discovered it. It wasn't his leukemia virus, it was the LAV virus. And that had been donated by Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute to the National Cancer Institute, to Dr. Popovic was actually doing most of the research. He was like second in command. But the person who was the one saying, it's got to be this, because everyone wanted to know what was the underlying cause. And he wrote a seminal paper, Dr. Popovic did. That paper was then complete to make sure that he had independent confirmation that the virus that he acknowledged in the paper, by the way, he acknowledged that this was the LAV virus on loan from the Pasteur Institute Pasteur. The article was finished. He then gave the samples, 3 samples, to the National Cancer Institute's Electron Microscopic Division, and the head of that, Dr. Gorda, gave back the written material, and we have a copy of that, saying, I could not find anything in this sample except cellular debris. And in another sample, there was not any virus in here large enough to be a retrovirus. In other words, he said there is nothing here. So in the article, the Dr. Popovic, who's still alive, and I hope is brought in to a committee under oath, he wrote that down. So it was a paper that said, well, let's continue research, but we have not, and he actually showed we have not found the cause of AIDS. Gallo was over in Europe trying to sell his antibody test. He comes back. Now, Popovic goes on vacation. I believe he went skiing. And Gallo scribbles through this article and all over it and changes the entire outcome of the article. Now, in my opinion, that is scientific fraud. But that article then goes out, and Science magazine only sees the redone version with the scribbled notes intact, or excluded, so you don't see what the original manuscript. And that's what was published. That and 3 other articles. The other 3 were based upon the original article. And who was the lead author of that article? Dr. Popovic. This was published in Science magazine. So the whole world was suddenly told, we have the cause of AIDS. And it's not your lifestyle. It's not amyl nitrate, which caused Kaposi sarcoma. The scientific articles, hundreds, showed that. And it doesn't cause, this is not the cause of your pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. It doesn't cause dementia, doesn't cause thrush. It does cause all those, but not any of your lifestyle. So now you had a politically correct virus that we were told by Fauci even children could pick up if they got breathed on by their parents. Got the clip of that also. And the world lost its mind.
I mean, it's the same playbook. It's as if they took out the old AIDS playbook, dusted it off, put in a different disease, different protocol, but basically the same basic fundamental fraud.
You're correct, Ken, you're right. And now what I was doing early this morning is I was reviewing the leaders in Washington, D.C., at the CDC, at the U.S. Public Health Service at that time, and how they were saying it couldn't just be the virus, there has to be cofactors. And some of these were working with a lot of AIDS patients, one in San Francisco, for example, one doctor there. And he said, you've got a huge gay community here, but 98% of them are not infected with HIV, don't have any symptoms because they're not living a fast track. And so that was politically incorrect. You couldn't bring in lifestyle. You couldn't bring in cofactors. And all the other doctors said it's got to be the cofactors. And that's what was posited. And in comes Gallo saying, nope. And Fauci says, nope, you want funding? Then it's one virus that can cause 30 different symptoms. Remember, AIDS symptoms were real, but they had always been there. And now they're all supposed to be due to one condition. Well, how in the world does his test have any legitimacy when it's not a gold standard? The ELISA test was very, very problematic. I got the package insert, and on the package insert that everyone took, I had to take it every year because my insurance for my company said that since I had a large policy, in case anything happened to me, my work would continue with my small company. I had to get this. And so I would say to the doctor, give me this test. It says here that do not use this test as confirmatory that I have any virus. Yeah, I know, but we still have to do it.
Yeah.
And so if people knew that malaria, tuberculosis, schistosomiasis, malnutrition, vitamin D deficiency, pregnancy, human herpes virus, especially herpes 8. Now, have you heard of herpes 8?
No, I haven't actually.
Well, herpes 8 was supposed to have been one of the primary cofactor causes. And who discovered that? A mainstream orthodox doctor and scientist discovered that, who headed up one of the federal government's AIDS program. And they're all talking about, you got these cofactors, and you got 80 different cofactors that if you have these cofactors and you test with the ELISA test, you can test positive. And then this stupid test that was absolutely worthless, that around the world, including Great Britain, even the pro-AIDS HIV scientist who headed over there said, we don't even use the Western blot. Ask the average doctor what the Western blot is. They can't tell you. And yet everybody was playing this game. Why? Because the money was going to people. If you had a country that had massive malaria, and then those malaria cases were diagnosed with symptoms, oh, you got a dry cough, you got fatigue, you've lost body weight, then you've got AIDS. Then you got money. You got a whole condom program. Okay, so everyone has a condom. But what about clean water and clean, healthy food and medicines for the diseases that they have? No, you don't get any of that. And we saw more of this with Bill Gates and his vaccine programs in India and in Africa, and with COVID as well. So you see the same flawed model they used then, Fauci has been using today, except then the house of cards didn't fall. Today, the entire house of cards is collapsing, and massive lawsuits are going to be coming forth. An embarrassment to those who had a choice and resources to find the truth and chose not to. They went the party line. Now, why they went the party line, I do not ever say, because I have no right to assume what was in a person's mind, even when they make a clearly and incontrovertibly bad choice. So that's where we're at. And so your book on this topic is absolutely essential reading, in my opinion. And I just want to share with the audience some of the statements from Ken's book. And you can go to Ken's website to get his book, and I definitely recommend it. Here are some of the important statements. And you credit the chbmp.org. I repeat that, chbmp.org. The things that they did that impacted the patient and their family. One, I'll go just through 5 of these. Isolation of the victim. Victim is denied any access to family, friends, advocates, pastor, priest, or clergy, etc. Imagine what it's like when you are told you're dying and you're not allowed to even see people who give you the spiritual and emotional comfort. 2, strict adherence to the EUA protocols. Quote, only option allowed to victims are hospital protocol drugs, remdesivir, and the drugs that we knew would cause organ collapse. Now, you mentioned, Ken, earlier that this remdesivir was a drug that failed. Well, let's talk about how bad it failed. First of all, it was never tested for COVID, and it was only tested for the Ebola in a country in Africa where 51% of the people died taking it. Wow. So that was 51% of the people die. You're going to use that as your standard? Fauci did, because remember, he was the architect, just like he was the one who promoted AZT. And he was the one who said there are no cures. In fact, all of his top people said there's no cure. When you get HIV infected, and you'll know from this ELISA test, confirmed with Western blot, then you do not have time on your side. So put it on your side by taking AZT at 1,600 milligrams. Today, any doctor giving 1,600 milligrams of AZT would lose their license, and the patient would lose their life. Well, guess what? 2,000 patients with full-blown AIDS came to the Tri-State Healing Center, and not one of them died. All of them returned to good health, even though 9% were still HIV positive. So that should tell you that it was the cofactors. And 18 people decided to go onto an advanced protocol. And that advanced protocol was up to 200,000 milligrams of vitamin C. No one had ever done that before. And I worked with my medical team. I had a medical team of 22 medical team, top board certified physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, but it was a holistic protocol. Do you know that in the 15 years, not a single drug was ever given in that Tri-State Healing Center, and yet patients with end-stage diseases had those diseases reversed? And then 18 people went on a protocol that they didn't come in once every 2 weeks or once a week. They came in every day for 6 days for 16 months. I paid for the whole therapy. Not a single AIDS patient ever paid a penny. Every single one of them reversed their HIV status. I was 8 times I was invited on Tony Brown's Journal with the medical records and the blood workups and the patients to tell their story. Bill McCree.
Gary, you made a film about that, didn't you? Was there a film about your clinic? I seem to remember. What's the name of it?
I didn't make the film. It was the International Society of Independent Journalists. It was called The Cost of Denial. So on the one hand, we're curing people with AIDS. On the other hand, Anthony Fauci is causing the death of people with AIDS, and yet he got all the attention, no criticism, because it was all political. If you took the politics out of AIDS, if you took the politics out of COVID, if you took the money out of COVID, you said $10,000 for a nurse to come for a week. Well, how about a nurse that said it was up to, $75,000 a week for a doctor?
Yeah,
Do you know any doctor in America making $75,000 a week as a brain surgeon? No. If you took the money out, if you took the profitability out of medicine would shrink by about 90%. Now, Ken, we're up to 4 minutes left. I'm going to let you continue on now to summarize what the nurses told you. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do another edition of this program where we're just going to have the edited nurses come on, and you can do an introduction to that for my noon program. This is our progressive commentary hour for Tuesday evenings. So give us the best summation you can of what the nurses told you and what you discovered, and the public has yet to know this.
Well, to recap the most important things, just like with the AIDS tests, they had a COVID test. And if you tested positive, suddenly all medical practice and scientific reasoning and common sense went out the window. And instead of treating the patient with the problem that the patient presented with, they would put them on a very rigid protocol, which was patently destructive to people's health. The remdesivir, the invasive ventilation, the heavy use of tranquilizers. And in the very early days, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of fake terror that had been created by the news media. And so things happen. But once it was obvious that these protocols weren't working and they were injuring, it was like a train that could not be stopped. And any nurse that stood up, the few doctors that did, any respiratory therapist that stood up was slapped down hard. First chalked to, then fired. Then if they persisted, chased down. Every step of the protocol, this deadly protocol, was financially incentivized. A hospital was paid simply for admitting somebody with a positive COVID test. Now remember, a lot of these people didn't even have respiratory problems. They could have come in with anything. But if they had a positive COVID test, they were put into an alternate medical reality where Alice in Wonderland, where nothing made sense and everything was upside down. The biggest problem that I see is, one, very few people are aware of this, of what happened, because your loved one would go into the hospital, you'd hear they had COVID, they'd be swept into the ICU, you couldn't see them, an advocate couldn't see them, a chaplain couldn't see them. If you had a family member who was a nurse or a doctor, they couldn't see them. If you had a paid advocate, they couldn't see them. So all this happened under cover of darkness. And then they declare that your patient is, your loved one is dead. You have no idea how they died. You weren't there. You didn't see it. Now,
Ken, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to continue this. But for people listening, this book is a must read. It is called What the Nurses Saw. My guest, Ken McCarthy, he is the author of it. A lot of research went into this, and it's well researched, well founded. And his website is whatthenursessaw.com. And I want to thank everyone for listening, because what we are showing, and I hope that you're beginning to see, is that the efforts by a certain small group of people to maintain control of the narrative, and that narrative is wrong, in part or whole. And as a result, you don't get to see the real underlying causes of death. But now we have that. Since the vaccines, we have over 3,500 articles in the peer-reviewed literature showing that everything else we were told before the vaccines and during the vaccines were wrong, deadly wrong. And we will continue to expose this crime against humanity. And again, we mentioned the AIDS. Why? Because it's the same architect and the same methodology of create massive fear, create panic, overstate your case, and then have the power of Congress and of world governments like the corrupt World Health Organization and the UN back you up. So who's going to advocate for the average person? And that is a problem that we have in our country. So I'm going to invite Ken back, and please share this with other people. Have a nice day, everyone.